A very good afternoon to all the participants, and at the outset, let me congratulate Dr. Rainis, Dr. Thomas Walker, and Dr. Lisha and other members of the team DM Pulmonary Medicine Department of Amala Institute Thrissur for coming up with this very innovative e-learning program. And I think the COVID issue has really forced us into a shell that this is the only way that we can meet each other, we can share our thoughts, and we can start off with educational endeavors. And again, thanks to all of you for allowing me to be a part of this star-studded faculty. Now, the topic that has been allotted to me today is the indications of mechanical ventilation. So, what are the factors that, as practicing clinicians and intensivists and pulmonologists, what are the things that we have to think of before we start putting a patient on mechanical ventilation, or what are the clinical scenarios that we have to think of before initiating a patient on mechanical ventilation? That's what I will be trying to share with in the next 35 or 40 minutes. So I will try to share my thoughts in these headings. First of all, a simplistic model of mechanical ventilation. What are the ventilator devices? What are the accessory devices? And what are the pathophysiological advantages of each of these components of the mechanical ventilation circuit when it comes to a sick patient? Then we come to the common indications, both the diseases as well as the clinical scenarios that make us think of initiating a patient on mechanical ventilation. And then we'll have a look at the usual diseases, and in each of these diseases, when is the situation that we will think of mechanical ventilation. And of course, at the end of that, we can have a question and answer session, because I feel time will be surplus. So in some way, I think my lecture will be similar to some of these Malayalam serials, because if you really want, the indications of mechanical ventilation can be summarized into a few slides or a few minutes or a max of one table. But unfortunately, Dr. Ennis has asked me to give a full lecture of 1 hour on the indication of mechanical ventilation. So I find myself in a position of a serial director where a 2-3 episode story has to be really stretched to a matter of a few weeks to months. So we'll start off with a disclaimer that, again, I have really stretched my topic.
I would like to pause you here. I'm sorry. So the presentation is not visible. If you can just restart this.
Okay. Hello.
Sir, share your percentage. Share. Sir, just press the share button. The slide is not visible.
Is it visible now?
Sir, you
Okay.
are, sir, no, it is already there in your desktop. It is seeing. Sir, you open the slide in the desktop and then share, sir. So because you can't take from here, so you close this and already you open from the desktop and you share the slide.
It's there in the desktop. It's open in the desktop.
Yes, and now you
share.
you can share and you can attach.
Screen share ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും, അതേപോലെ PPT സെപ്പറേറ്റ് എടുത്ത് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യാനും പറ്റും. ഷെയർ ദ സ്ക്രീൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ഓപ്ഷനാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ സെർച്ച് ചെയ്തതെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു. അതും ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. അതേപോലെ ഷെയർ PPT എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു ഓപ്ഷനും കാണും ഷെയർ ചെയ്യുന്നിടത്ത്.
ഈ ഷെയറില് എടുക്കുമ്പോ
ഷെയർ യുവർ സ്ക്രീൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് കാണുന്നുണ്ടോ സാറേ?
സ്ക്രീൻ ഷെയർ കാണുന്നുണ്ട്.
അത് ക്ലിക്ക് ചെയ്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അത് ക്ലിക്ക് ചെയ്താലും സാറിന് ഇത് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. അപ്പോൾ ലാപ്ടോപ്പിൽ ഓപ്പൺ ചെയ്തിട്ട് ശരിക്കും സാർ ഓപ്പൺ ചെയ്താൽ മതി, പിന്നെ ആ PPT ഓപ്പൺ ചെയ്താൽ മതി. ഷെയർ സ്ക്രീൻ കൊടുത്തു സാർ?
Yes, sir, already done that.
Okay, sir. Now it's okay.
Sir, perfect.
Okay.
From where should I restart?
Sir, this is the first slide now, which your presentation first slide. To initiate or not, you can go on, sir.
Okay, then I have to start right from the beginning.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah, it's audible.
Yes, sir.
Now the slides are clear. To initiate or not, indications of mechanical ventilation. The first slide.
Okay. So
thank you, Rajesh.
Okay. So again, thanks to Dr. Ennis and CIPLA team for organizing this CME series on mechanical ventilation. So I will try to briefly share what are the indications to initiate a patient on mechanical ventilation. So I will just start off with a simplistic model of the ventilator circuit and the accessories, and then what each accessory does as a pathophysiological advantage in a sick patient, the common indications, the common scenarios, and then probably we will discuss when we should think of mechanical ventilation in all these individual diseases. So that's what I said, that this is a lecture that is similar to many of the Malayalam serials, because this is something, a topic that can actually be simplified to a few slides, but unfortunately we are having a whole session on that, so I will have to really expand the thing, just like many of the Malayalam serial directors are doing, where a few sessions can actually be actually they are expanding it to a few weeks to months. So we'll start off with a couple of disclaimers that we are really stressing the topic, and again I am focusing more on real life scenarios than on studies and published evidences, because ultimately when it comes to initiation of mechanical ventilation, this is a situation where we have a very sick patient. So it's practically impossible to conduct high quality studies when it comes to initiation of mechanical ventilation, because that will be unethical and that will put or further endanger the life of a sick patient. So if we can just share with you a very simplified model of the machinery for mechanical ventilation. First of all, the mechanical ventilator has a compressor which can deliver gas under pressure, a breathing mixture under pressure. Now inside the main body of the ventilator, there is an oxygen blender which can give you varying proportions of FiO2 depending upon the amount of oxygen that is mixed into the respiratory air that we breathe in. So it derives very clear-cut, very exact amount of FiO2. Then there are the tubes and valves. There is the inspiratory tubing, there is the expiratory tubing. Both of them connect at the Y junction to form a common pathway. There are valves at multiple places by which you can stop the inspiration, stop the expiration, all those things. And finally, there is an artificial airway, usually an endotracheal tube, by which this mechanical ventilatory circuits actually connect to the respiratory tract of the patient. So these are the ways, and in addition, you have a monitor which actually gives you parameters of how the ventilator is delivering the breath, how the patient is taking it, and how the patient is having his parameters. All these things can be monitored and exhibited so that the caregiver can adjust his settings accordingly. So as I said, there's the compressor with settings, so which generates breathing mixture under pressure. So the clinical utility of this is that it actually obviates the work of breathing. The patient doesn't have to perform his inspiratory work. And again, the breathing pattern can be decided due to the presence of tubings and valves. If you see the blender, it mixes oxygen and ambient air. So due to this reason, it can deliver precise FiO2s and very high FiO2s to the tune of even 100%. The tubes and valves actually delivers or blocks the airflow. Sorry. Hello. Hello. It delivers and blocks airflow and avoids leaks. That way controls the breathing pattern of the patient. And the artificial airway is actually the connection between the ventilator and the patient's airway. So it acts as a conduit for airway protection, because in conditions where there is an unstable airway, like an airway tumor compressing the airway, or if there is a very flaccid airway, like tracheobronchomalacia, where the airway is compressible. So the artificial airway actually maintains an airway patency. And in addition, there's a port for secretion clearance. Because if the patient is producing a very large amount of secretion which actually cannot be handled, then secretion clearance can be achieved with the presence of this artificial airway. And as a common accompaniment to mechanical ventilation, we provide sedation and paralysis for the patient so that the patient accepts the mechanical ventilation well. So this calms down the patient, and in another way, this decreases the oxygen demand and the carbon dioxide production. So that way, the ventilatory demand and the oxygen demand of the patient can also be decreased indirectly by mechanical ventilation. So with this background, what are the common indications of clinical situations where we resort to mechanical ventilation? So cardiac arrest or a pericardiac arrest scenario, or a respiratory arrest or an impending respiratory arrest in the next few, say, minutes or something like that. So these are scenarios where there is an absolute indication for mechanical ventilation as per the ACLS. If you are in the BLS setting, if you are in a unmonitored or facility where you don't have much things, then obviously you cannot get an artificial airway. But in a monitored in-hospital setting where there is a cardiac or respiratory arrest or a pericardio-respiratory arrest, this is a situation where, in addition to chest compressions, you have to go ahead with an artificial airway without interrupting the cardiopulmonary cycle, without interrupting the compression cycle. Okay. Now, other maybe relative indications for mechanical ventilation include extreme tachypnea, severe respiratory distress, and excessive work of breathing. Now, this is a scenario where if you just allow it to happen like that, despite the best of medical treatment, it's only a matter of time that the respiratory muscles are going to fatigue, and the patient is going to progress to something near a impending respiratory arrest or a cardiac arrest. So this has to be identified at the right time, and mechanical ventilation has to be instituted at the right time, not early, not late. Again, respiratory failure, severe hypoxemia or hypercapnia due to a multitude of causes. They are indications for mechanical ventilation, provided the primary disease is not responding to initial therapy. Extreme inability to maintain an airway, that can happen as a result of laryngeal edema or airway tumors, or structurally unsupported airway like severe obstructive sleep apnea or severe tracheobronchomalacia, all these things. Inability to maintain an airway or inadequate consciousness making the patient inability to maintain an airway. These are situations for mechanical ventilation. Inability to clear the airway secretions. If the airway secretions are huge in amount, as occurs in case of organophosphorus poisoning or bronchoalveolar carcinoma with a large amount of bronchoria which cannot be actually tackled, or bronchiectasis with copious secretions and poor cough reflex. Such situations is an indication for mechanical ventilation. Then circulatory shock. Any patient with cardiac failure, myocardial infarction or unstable arrhythmias, or sepsis with a circulatory shock, metabolic shock, all these things are indication for mechanical ventilation. And excessive metabolic demands, where the supply of oxygen is inadequate to meet the metabolic demands, hypermetabolic states, like again sepsis, thyrotoxicosis, hyperpyrexia. These are some of the situations where we have to think of mechanical ventilation. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the common situations where we resort to mechanical ventilation. And again, it has to be remembered that the decision is influenced by the magnitude of the disease, magnitude of change from the baseline that the disease produces. Like if the magnitude from the disease from the baseline is huge, magnitude of change is huge, then that is an indication for mechanical ventilation. Acuteness of the change. That means if the same change happens over a longer period of time, then that is better tolerated by the physiology of the patient, whereas acute changes are very poorly tolerated. And the response to initial treatment, very important. Whatever be the scenario, unless if it is a pericardiac arrest or peri-respiratory arrest scenario, we always resort to a few minutes of initial treatment, and if the patient doesn't respond or worsens on that initial treatment, that is the situation when we think of implementing mechanical ventilation. Now, some of the cardiac arrest and pericardiac arrest scenarios include acute MI with cardiogenic shock, acute massive pulmonary thromboembolism, tachyarrhythmias or bradyarrhythmias with poor peripheral perfusion, acute cardiogenic pulmonary edema, electrocution, acute major cardiac tamponade, etc. Again, in a cardiac arrest or a impending cardiac arrest situation, securing of the artificial airway and delivery of breath form an integral part of the ACLS algorithm along with chest compressions. So this is an absolute indication for mechanical ventilation. The second group will be respiratory arrest and peri-respiratory arrest scenarios. This includes a lot of conditions: a CNS trauma, cerebrovascular accident involving the brainstem, a brainstem encephalitis or meningitis, etc. Consumption of respiratory depressant agents like anesthetics, sedatives, ethanol, opiates, etc. A late stage of respiratory muscle fatigue. If the respiratory muscles are forced to contract at high tensions for a long period of time, they go into a state of reversible fatigue whereby they are no longer able to take the respiratory load. So ultimately this goes to a respiratory failure. So a later stage of respiratory muscle fatigue is a situation where there is an impending respiratory arrest. Again, aspiration, it may be a mechanical substance aspiration, or it can be toxic fume aspiration, many of those inhalations, all those things, drowning, spinal cord and neuromuscular diseases, etc., etc. Again, a respiratory arrest scenario is a situation where securing of an artificial airway and delivery of breath form an integral part of ACLS algorithm. Again, this becomes almost a mandatory indication for mechanical ventilation. The effect of mechanical ventilation in cardiopulmonary arrest situations: it allows airway patency, it allows oxygenation, it allows ventilation, it decreases the metabolic demand and gives muscle rest. If it's a fatigue situation, after mechanical ventilation for a few hours or maybe a couple of days, the fatigued muscles can actually come back to the normal functional status and weaning process can be initiated. And what does mechanical ventilation achieve in cardiac arrest? Again, it ensures mechanical airway patency and protects against aspiration, collapse, or secretions. It ensures adequate oxygenation by giving a deep and high FiO2 as needed. It ensures ventilation where the tidal volume and respiratory rate are externally controllable and you can achieve your target pH or PCO2 levels. It takes away the work of breathing and refreshes the respiratory muscles and decreases the metabolic oxygen demand and carbon dioxide production because sedation paralysis is achieved and there is no metabolic work of breathing because oxygenation and ventilation are adequately taken care of. Now, excessive work of breathing going to a stage of respiratory muscle fatigue can occur in a multitude of conditions like acute exacerbation of airway diseases, asthma, COPD, bronchiectasis, bronchiolitis, etc. Alveolar diseases like pulmonary edema, pneumonia, alveolar hemorrhage, etc. Advanced interstitial lung diseases, which again can be due to a multitude of causes like idiopathic interstitial pneumonias, connective tissue disorders, drug-induced, etc. Many extrapulmonary diseases can actually promote excessive work of breathing like sepsis, hepatic failure, metabolic acidosis due to renal failure, or many other causes, etc. Now, in these scenarios, what we need to do is if the patient is presenting with excessive work of breathing and you feel that he may go into a respiratory muscle fatigue, institute rapid treatment of the primary cause. For example, if it is an asthma, then give rapidly acting inhaled or nebulized bronchodilators, maybe intravenous bronchodilators, oxygen supplementation, all those things. Maybe a cautious trial of NIV. See the response within a few minutes to maximum of around half to 2 hours. the patient is not responding, this is a situation where you think of actually mechanical ventilation. The decision for mechanical ventilation should neither be too fast nor be too late, because we know that if mechanical ventilation in certain diseases is delayed beyond the normal or beyond an acceptable range, then the outcomes are typically bad. So, severe hypoxemia and hypercapnia can occur in multitude of conditions. Again, the previous airway, alveolar, interstitial diseases that I described, pulmonary vascular diseases like severe pulmonary hypertension, pulmonary thromboembolism, etc. CNS diseases, again, trauma, infections, drugs, vascular, etc. Chest wall and neuromuscular diseases, obesity, etc. typically cause hypercapnia by hypoventilation. High altitude states can cause hypoxemia. Toxins and poisons can cause both hypoxemia and hypercapnia. And as I mentioned previously, the previous extrapulmonary diseases that I mentioned. Again, the approach should be more or less similar. See whether the patient is in a pericardiac arrest or peri-respiratory arrest situation. If yes, immediately go ahead with mechanical ventilation. If not, then give a cautious trial of treatment for the primary cause, along with say supplemental oxygen or a cautious trial of NIV. Assess response. If the patient is not promptly responding, make a decision to go ahead with mechanical ventilation. Airway compromise and huge amount of airway secretions can occur in situations like anaphylaxis with laryngeal edema, major facial or neck burns, airway stricture, airway tumors, extra airway tumors like mediastinal lesions compressing the airways, foreign body aspiration, etc. Excessive secretions can occur in lung abscess, bronchiectasis, bronchoalveolar carcinoma, cystic fibrosis, organophosphorus poisoning, etc. Again, in such cases, conservative measures will be adequate in the vast majority, except for major anaphylaxis with laryngeal edema. Some cases of major burns involving the face or neck may need prophylactic mechanical ventilation and airway stabilization. But in these conditions, like especially airway stricture, tumor, foreign body, etc., airway interventions might help, but might need a rigid bronchoscope also for that. So excessive metabolic demand, where the requirement of oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide is more than what can be achieved by the normal power of the respiratory muscles or ventilatory capacities. Such situations can occur in heat stroke, hyperpyrexia, thyrotoxicosis, sepsis, etc. So usually a septic shock needing resuscitation merits mechanical ventilation and an artificial airway. Other situations may respond to conservative treatment, but in especially heat stroke and hyperpyrexia, where you get a lot of muscle breakdown, rhabdomyolysis, etc., that may be a situation where you think of mechanically ventilating the patient. Now, these are the common clinical scenarios where we think of mechanical ventilation. I will just move on to the individual diseases per se. A few diseases where we will have a detailed discussion will be asthma, COPD, ILD, neuromuscular disorders, ARDS, and sepsis with septic shock. Sepsis with septic shock, as a general rule, I won't discuss much because usually most of the clinical scenario or other papers where septic shock has been studied, if there is a vasopressor or fluid resuscitation requiring septic shock, most of the workers have gone ahead with mechanical ventilation. So that way, that is a relative indication to go ahead with mechanical ventilation right at the onset. Other diseases we will just discuss in some detail. So first of all, acute severe asthma. A patient presenting with an acute attack of asthma needs a rapid assessment in the emergency department with a very brief focused history, a targeted physical examination, and a limited battery of investigations. The brief history should include the baseline status of the patient, the onset and severity of symptoms, comorbidities, and previous ER as well as ICU visits or need for mechanical ventilation. The targeted physical examination should look at the respiratory rate, the work of breathing and the use of accessory muscles, the heart rate, the ability of the patient to speak in words or sentences, the level of consciousness, and any evidence of complications or precipitating factors like pneumonia, pneumothorax, atelectasis, etc. A very limited battery of investigations. If it is a mild exacerbation, look at the peak expiratory flow rate. Otherwise, go ahead with the arterial blood gas evaluation, a spirometer, SpO2 monitoring, continuous SpO2 monitoring, a chest radiogram, and an ECG examination. So these are the usual things that we look at for assessing the severity. The clinical status of the patient, especially the work of breathing and the ability to speak in sentences, CNS functions, then continuous oxygen monitoring, blood gases, chest X-ray, ECG. So if the patient can speak only in words or cannot talk, or if there is significant tachycardia, or if there is significant tachypnea, usually more than 30 per minute, the accessory muscles are very active. If the saturation is less than 90, if the carbon dioxide is normal or elevated, these are situations where we take the exacerbation as severe or even life-threatening. Just to be remembered that a severe exacerbation, there will be pulsus paradoxus, whereas if the respiratory muscles go into fatigue, you may not even be able to appreciate the pulsus paradoxus. So don't take it as a marker of less severe disease. So the initial approach to asthma will be give supplementary oxygen via a nasal cannula or a nasal mask, give short-acting beta-2 agonists by the inhaled use either with an MDA or spacer or even a nebulizer, especially in the severe attacks, prefer a nebulizer. You can add a short-acting anti-muscarinic agents. Systemic glucocorticoids can be started, but then the effect takes time. Although many of the guidelines don't mention, we always prefer using intravenous theophylline supplements, which works very well in Indian population, and avoid sedation. Reassess the patient at the end of say 30 to 60 minutes. Again, take into account multiple parameters. The same things, the respiratory rate, exhaustion, mental status, hemodynamic status, etc. Most importantly, the response to initial treatment. If there is worsening of the parameters from the baseline, that is the time when you think of ventilatory assistance in asthmatic attacks. And again, refractory hypoxemia, pseudo-normalization of PCO2 or elevation of PCO2, you think of ventilatory assistance in asthma. Again, it has to be remembered that the predominant site of airflow resistance is large airways in asthma, and these airways are more rigid owing to subepithelial fibrosis, so they are less collapsible, and at the same time, the driving pressures need to be more to achieve adequate ventilation. They have the propensity to develop severe airflow limitation. Gas trapping with auto-PEEP is very common in asthma attacks. NIV in acute severe asthma, evidence is mounting, but in general, because of the reasons that I said, it's a predominantly airway disease. The airway resistance is pretty high. So medium level of external pressures via the NIV may not be adequate to overcome the airway resistance. So NIV has a weak role in acute severe asthma. Yes, you can go ahead with NIV in a monitored setting, very short time, with a decision to go ahead with mechanical ventilation at the earliest sign of failure. As I said, even with NIV, look at the magnitude of change from the baseline, acuteness of change from the baseline, and the promptness of response to initial therapy. Ventilating an asthmatic is a nightmare. I think that will be an additional class, but it has to be remembered that ventilation in asthmatic is difficult and weaning is easy. In contrary to COPD, where once you intubate, the ventilation may not be that difficult, but weaning will be difficult. So the indications for mechanical ventilation in asthma, see the initial response to initial treatment. NIV in asthma should be used very cautiously. If there is worsening on the best initial treatment, go for mechanical ventilation in the presence of severe work of breathing, tachypnea, tachycardia, normalization or elevation of PCO2. Now we come to acute exacerbation of COPD. Here, NIV has a much higher role than in asthma, as we will see. The ideal candidate for non-invasive ventilation in COPD are subjects with moderate to severe exacerbations, with moderate or severe work of breathing and axillary muscle use, and some degree of respiratory acidosis. Usually a pH somewhere between 7.2 to 7.35 and a PCO2 of more than 45 is the ideal candidate for NIV in an acute exacerbation of COPD in the absence of contraindications. Now, what are those contraindications that I will come to in one of my subsequent slides? The role is much clearer if the pH is normal. ideally instituted in the ICU as an add-on to optimal medical therapy, but in experienced centers, this can be instituted even in the wards with good monitoring. And NIV is also an ideal tool for early mechanical ventilation in COPD patients. NIV has been shown to decrease the need of mechanical ventilation and complications like VAP and duration of hospital stay. There are a lot of randomized trials of NIV in COPD, and most of them have consistently shown that they decrease the risk of mechanical ventilation in COPD patients. So even hypercapnic coma is not a real contraindication. You can go ahead with a very short trial of NIV even in hypercapnic coma patients, where the mode is ideally BPAP or even adaptive, with a backup rate. Monitoring the response, subjectively dyspnea as perceived by the patient, the clinical parameters like heart rate, respiratory rate, work of breathing, neurological status is very important, ABG values. The contraindications for NIV in general would be indications for mechanical ventilation, like inability to protect the airways, very poor cough reflex, very poor mental status where the patient cannot maintain an airway, hemodynamic instability like uncontrolled arrhythmias, high dose of inotropic supports, recent MI, etc. Severe GI symptoms like persistent vomiting, obstructed bowel, recent GI surgery, etc. Life-threatening hypoxemia or imminent respiratory arrest, significantly altered mentation, huge copious amount of secretions. And again, please look at this point, a totally unmotivated patient, a non-availability of trained medical personnel for NIV or extreme obesity are also relative contraindications for instituting NIV. These are actually indications to go ahead with mechanical ventilation if your patients require ventilatory assistance. The predictors of success with NIV, anyone who responds well initially is the one who has an ultimate success rate. So anyone who responds with NIV responds fast. And that will be evident by a reduction in respiratory rate, improvement in neurological score, etc., etc. And anyone who is better compliant to NIV will have better success. So regarding the indication for mechanical ventilation in acute exacerbation of COPD, in subjects of acute exacerbation of COPD who require some form of ventilatory assistance, NIV is the treatment of choice in the absence of contraindications. If the patient has any contraindication for NIV, or if the patient has lack of improvement or worsening of NIV, the usual time that we give for NIV to decide whether it is successful or is a failure is around half an hour to 2 hours. If that happens, worsening on mechanical or worsening on NIV, then go ahead with mechanical ventilation, and the worsening or failure of NIV will be evidenced by severe work of breathing, extreme tachypnea, severe tachycardia, worsening mentation, worsening blood gases, especially worsening PCO2 and falling pH, etc. Again, as I said previously, ventilation is relatively easy in COPD, meaning may be challenging. Now coming to the indication of mechanical ventilation in acute respiratory distress syndrome. Again, ARDS is a heterogeneous condition, and there are many etiologies that can actually ultimately lead to ARDS. But in general, ventilatory support is indicated in almost all cases of ARDS. And ARDS is a very strong indication for mechanical ventilation, especially the moderate and severe cases of ARDS where the PF ratio is less than 200. Mild ARDS, there may be a role for non-invasive ventilation. If non-invasive ventilation is carried out, a helmet NIV and high-flow nasal cannula are the preferred modes. But if you are instituting NIV, have a very close monitoring, proceed to mechanical ventilation at the earliest sign of non-response, non-compliance, or failure. I just thought I will share this particular study of NIV delivered via a helmet in ARDS. This may be pretty relevant even in our COVID scenarios, because these COVID scenarios, it is becoming increasingly clear that irrational mechanical ventilation or proceeding to mechanical ventilation at a very early stage actually causes catastrophic outcomes. So as far as possible, maintain the patient with a high flow nasal cannula. NIV again is relatively contraindicated in viral pneumonias with ARDS because the outcomes have been pretty bad with previous viral pneumonias, especially the MERS and previous H1N1 trials and all those things. So that relative contraindication of NIV may be extrapolatable to our current corona or COVID-19 pandemic also. But the delivery of supplemental oxygen via a high flow nasal cannula has been found very beneficial in subjects with COVID. Now, the rationale for NIV via helmet is that although the role of NIV in ARDS is less established, most studies have delivered NIV with a face mask. So, the high PEEP levels needed for ARDS ventilation may not be delivered or tolerated when NIV is being instituted via face mask. Whereas, if we deliver NIV via a helmet, it has a lack of contact with the patient's face and has a seal at the neck. So it offers much more comfort to the patient, much less air leak. At the same time, high pressures and high PEEP can be delivered. So that may be a rationale for using NIV via the helmet device for ARDS. In this particular study, actually looked at patients with mild to moderate ARDS, around 83 patients. The primary outcome was the rate of intubation and other outcomes like 28 days ventilator-free days and all those things. And there was some inequality in the baseline characters, which actually is shown as a relative demerit of this study. But NIV delivered via the helmet resulted in huge improvements in the outcome. The intubation rate, ventilation-free rate, length of stay in ICU, mortality, everything was better with the NIV delivered via helmet route. And again, this was the first randomized control trial in helmet NIV versus face mask. It had a very sound rationale, but a small sample size and a single center study, and confounded by ICU ventilator use in helmet group. So, if I can just summarize the indications for mechanical ventilation in ARDS subjects, in general, an early mechanical ventilation strategy is suggested in subjects with moderate and severe ARDS, characterized by a PF ratio of less than 200. But a cautious trial of NIV may be worthwhile in mild ARDS with a PF ratio of 200 to 300 in the absence of contraindications. But this has to be in a very closely monitored setting with a preparedness to go ahead with mechanical ventilation at the earliest sign of failure. Mechanical ventilation in ARDS allows provision for very high FiO2, allows heavy sedation and neuromuscular blockade, which actually has itself been shown to be beneficial in severe ARDS and has to be shown to improve the outcomes in severe ARDS. And mechanical ventilation also allows for very effective recruitment maneuvers to be performed, although the role of recruitment maneuvers itself is controversial. Now, in cases with pneumonia and respiratory failure, what's the role of mechanical ventilation? Now, ventilatory support may be indicated for severe hypoxia, severe work of breathing, or septic shock associated with pneumonia. Again, a very cautious trial of NIV may be performed, but the failure rate is high in isolated pneumonia. The failure rate is higher in elderly subjects more than 65 years of age. So, this subject should have a very low threshold for intubation. And again, as I mentioned previously, previous experiences share that viral pneumonia with ARDS or viral pneumonias per se, there is a high failure rate of NIV. So HFNC may be a better option, especially considering the current COVID-19 scenario. There's some difference when it comes to pneumonia in an immunocompromised subjects, like those with HIV, active HIV infection, leukemias or lymphomas, subjects with febrile neutropenias, on immunosuppressive drug therapy, disseminated malignancies, etc. In these subjects, a more conservative approach to mechanical ventilation is chosen because the mechanical ventilation in this subgroup of patients has a higher risk of secondary complications. So this
Hello.
Hello. Rajesh, we are inaudible. Sudhir, can you hear me? I think no one is audible.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So where should I begin? Where should I? How many slides were missed?
Immunosuppressed, ventilation in immunosuppressed, Rajesh.
Okay, this was visible, no?
It's right now
Yes, sir.
visible.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, that's the last slide. Okay, continue, please.
So I was just sharing with you. Hello. Okay. So I was just sharing with you that if you summarize the mechanical ventilation in a pneumonia patient, in general, if someone with pneumonia and respiratory failure requires ventilatory assistance, the first modality of choice will be a mechanical ventilation. You can try a very cautious trial of NIV in a monitored setting with a decision to go ahead with mechanical ventilation if that fails. The only situation where this law is not valid will be pneumonia with respiratory failure in an immunocompromised patient, where you have a conservative approach to mechanical ventilation and a more liberal kind of imaging. Now, I will share with you some case scenarios that will help you to understand the role of mechanical ventilation and the indication of mechanical ventilation. Just compare the first case and the second case. The first case is a 45-year-old gentleman with a well-controlled systemic hypertension. He has presented to us with fever, cough, and pleuritic pain for 2 days and worsening shortness of breath for 2 days. He has a respiratory rate of 32, moderate work of breathing, heart rate of 124, and a saturation of 91% on room air. Now see the second case, a 66-year-old gentleman with IPF, fever and cold for 3 days, respiratory rate of 34 per minute, heart rate of 101, and an SpO2 of 89% on room air. Now, if we compare these two people, absolute parameter wise, the second gentleman has a much more profound hypoxia and a greater respiratory rate. But it has to be remembered that he is a gentleman with an IPF, and his previous record showed that his baseline saturation was 92% only, and he always had some degree of tachypnea. His baseline respiratory rate, even when he didn't have any other additional disease, was around 28. Whereas the first gentleman was a perfect gentleman other than having a very well-controlled systemic hypertension. His normal respiratory rate would be around 16, and his normal saturation would be around 99 or 100. So the magnitude of change from the baseline in the first gentleman is much more than the second gentleman. The first gentleman is much more sick as compared to the second one. And if mechanical ventilation is required, the first gentleman qualifies much higher than the second one. Now just look at case scenarios 3 and 4. Case number 3 is a 75-year-old gentleman with COPD and no other comorbidities, frequent exacerbations. He was exposed to some construction work at home with worsening wheeze for 3 weeks. So he presented with a respiratory rate of 28, moderate work of breathing, heart rate of 110, PCO2 of 66, and pH of 7.29. Whereas the fourth gentleman is a 70-year-old man with COPD, CAD, moderate LV dysfunction, DM, CKD, OSA, and obesity. He also presented with fever and cough for 3 days. He has a respiratory rate of 34. He is in respiratory distress, heart rate of 122, PCO2 is 55, and pH is 7.32. Again, comparing the third with the fourth gentleman, although the absolute parameters of PCO2 and pH may be better in the second person, it has to be remembered that the first gentleman has no medical comorbidities, one thing. He has a clear-cut atmospheric pollution triggered worsening rather than an infectious worsening. And this worsening happened in a period of 2 to 3 weeks. Whereas the second gentleman probably has a much faster worsening, fever and cough for 3 days. He has a lot of comorbidities, especially CAD and moderate LV dysfunction. He is in respiratory distress. And although the pH and PCO2 may be better, it has to be remembered that a COPD patient, when he develops a pneumonia, that can lead to some degree of hyperventilation and CO2 washout. So actually the second person is much more sick than the first person. Case number 4 is much sicker than the case number 3. So these 4 case scenarios I shared with you just to show that the magnitude of change from the baseline, the acuteness of change from the baseline, and the absolute values, or rather the impact of these changes in the physiology of the patient is much more important factors in determining whether the patient requires mechanical ventilation or not. Acute worsening is poorly tolerated. Gradual worsening is well tolerated. Medical comorbidities can definitely worsen the gravity of disease and outcome. Now again, the reversibility of underlying disease is a very important factor that decides whether the patient should go ahead with mechanical ventilation. Now this is a real life case which I encountered with a 68-year-old gentleman diabetic with mild nephropathy, ILD detected 4 years back, no cause found, probable IPF, on medical management, gradually worsening shortness of breath. He last presented to me around 7 months back. This was his CT at the last presentation. And functional evaluation at the last visit showed that he had an FVC of 50% and a DLCO of 22% predicted. This was his last visit around 6 to 7 months back. Now, he has come back after 6 months. He hails from outside India. He has come back after 6 months, has come in a very bad shape, significantly worsening shortness of breath, weight loss of 8 kilos, and at presentation to ER, he has an SpO2 of 76% on room air, a respiratory rate of 40 per minute, severe respiratory distress. And this is his X-ray and CT when he came. He has developed, in a short course, he has developed a new right upper lobe mass with mediastinal lymphadenopathy, which was actually not present in the X-ray around 6 to 7 months back. So if you look at this person, he has severe hypoxia, he has severe work of breathing. That way, he has indications to go ahead with mechanical ventilation. But if you look at him, what are the reversible factors in him? The interstitial lung disease has already progressed even the last visit to a state where the DLCO is only 22% of predicted. And on the top of that, he has developed a new malignancy with mediastinal lymphadenopathy. And I don't think anybody will be really daring to go ahead with institution of any specific treatment in this particular patient. So this is one situation where mechanical ventilation will be relatively futile, and we have to take a call of just going ahead with best supportive care as opposed to mechanical ventilation in such patients. And finally, respecting the patient's perspective and advanced directives is something that we have to make when it comes to deciding of mechanical ventilation. Advanced directives for do not intubation. This is something that happens very comfortably in the Western world, but unfortunately in our part of the world, we haven't really developed the culture of telling the patient that this is his disease, this is his prognosis, this is the expected length of life and other such things. But if you have a social, cultural and economic or even educational room for such advanced directive taking, maybe preferably talk from the patient and one reliable relative. He should have adequate knowledge of the disease, the potential course of the disease, the treatment options, the uncertainties of medical science. It may be that you are predicting one way that the patient will worsen. It may not happen in real life. So the uncertainties of medical science has to be acknowledged. Shared realistic decision making has to happen, and medical validity also has to be ensured. So if after all these parameters are satisfied, if the patient and the reliable relative goes ahead with the directive of avoiding ventilation in the case of worsening, that may be a situation where we can avoid mechanical ventilation. So if I summarize, mechanical ventilation is a very powerful respiratory life support tool in the hands of a practicing pulmonologist and intensivist. The absolute indications include cardiac and respiratory arrest or impending arrest. There are a lot of relative indications and scenarios. The aspects that we need to consider when we decide to mechanically ventilate a patient, as I said previously, will be the change from the baseline status and acuteness of the change, the potential for reversibility of the underlying pathology, and wishes from the patient's or the family side. Thank you. I think that finishes my lecture. I think Dr. Ennis, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Lisha are hearing me.
Yeah, we are hearing you, Dr. Rajesh. We are waiting for any questions from the attendees.
Okay. Who are the attendees or trainees only?
Can you see the messages? Sometimes they may be typing it for you.
Messages, no?
Not yet anyone.
I haven't seen anyone.
Yeah.
Sir, in chat box you can see.
Attendees, please, if you can type your questions, or you can directly unmute and ask the question to the our Dr. Rajesh. I think it was very clear. It was a nice presentation, Rajesh, even though there were some technical issues. It's very clear indications and when to initiate and when not has been well described
Okay.
as expected.
If there are
Very good talk, sir. Thank you, sir. Dr. Manju. Okay. Dr. Rajesh, what is your experience in intubating and any stories or experience from your side?
Stories, maybe I will just share rather than success stories. I will share only blunder stories.
Okay.
When I was doing my IDCCM, there was one scenario where I couldn't get airway at all. But then I always had a false confidence that our hospital in Apollo always had a pediatric bronchoscope. So I always had the confidence that even if I couldn't manage the laryngotracheal intubation, there is always a bronchoscope, so I can do a bronchoscopic intubation. So in that particular scenario, what happened was that my airway skills were not very good, so it was a difficult airway also, so I couldn't ventilate. Then the bronchoscope actually, I think nobody really uses bronchoscope for intubation because most of them are very good airway specialists. I started with the bronchoscope, and to my horror, actually the light of the bronchoscope was not working. Probably it was not checked for last few months and all. So ultimately, I couldn't ventilate. The bronchoscope, which I knew, is also not working. So practically, I had to bag and mask ventilate for almost 40 minutes till the time a better person came. So that was one indication, one scenario where I was practically, I thought I am doomed, but somehow the patient sustained till that time. Then mechanical ventilation, what stories, blunders.
Fortunately,
Yes.
we do have the luxury of that VLS, video laryngoscope. So in
Yes,
cases
yes.
of COPD with obese people, short neck,
Okay.
we rarely use experienced or an anesthetist is always on our side in case we foresee some difficult intubation always.
And another thing is when it goes to that hardcore critical care practice, when it comes to residents and consultants, there will be three heterogeneous groups. One will be people with internal medicine background. Second will be people with anesthesia background, and third will be people with pulmonary medicine background. So our consultants used to say that, okay, this internal medicine people, they have very good theoretical knowledge, but they don't do any procedures. They just talk. And secondly, they used to say, like, anesthesia people, they don't know any theory. They just, intubate, put lines and just push off like that. Other than that, nothing. And pulmonary medicine people, they neither know the theory nor know the procedure. So I think that was the maybe say 10 years, 15 years back. But I think scenario has changed where nowadays those who are coming for pulmonary medicine are very dynamic people. Maybe people like myself, Dr. Anis, Dr. Thomas, we can feel that the present generation who are opting for respiratory medicine are really dynamic people with very ambitious and very hardworking. I'm not saying that we are not hardworking, but then still, I think it's going in the right track. What do you feel?
That was the idea of this guest lecture series also. It should benefit the residents, the future residents from any specialty like anesthesia or internal medicine or pulmonary medicine or respiratory medicine, wherever they come from. They should have some knowledge about the mechanical ventilation, and it's our duty to make a platform for the knowledge delivery, as well as to give them the confidence and the courage to intubate and then go ahead with the mechanical ventilation and then beans of the patient. So that's what we will change the future. Don't worry, Dr. Rajesh. We all together, we have invited our anesthesia colleagues, we have invited the internal medicine colleagues, critical care intensivists and pulmonologists as well, depending on the topic they are going to deliver. So there are around 30 topics, so we will be overlooking all these topics. Then by the end of 2021 March, I think we probably all are well equipped, and even the COVID or SARS-CoV-3 comes, we will be confident enough to intubate and treat them very well.
Definitely.
That's our idea. Okay.
I think the present day respiratory medicine trainees are like a very enthusiastic, and I think the top guys actually take respiratory medicine. So that way, I think everyone is very enthusiastic. When is your first batch DM people graduating?
They are first years right now.
Sorry?
They are first years right now. They will be graduating in 2022.
22. Okay.
22.
Yeah, because once you have all the
I think as residents, we do have all from all the hospitals. We have DNB trainees. We have residents from anesthesia medicine as well as respiratory medicine.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Again, means it's a very normal idea, and I think credit goes to all of you for beginning with this platform, and especially when you have the talks recorded and they are available for the future also, it really benefits the trainees.
Hello, Rajesh.
Thomas ji, namaskaram.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent talk. Are you seeing Malayalam serials?
No. I don't see myself, but what happens is once you are in a home, there is no way that you really escape them. Someone will be seeing.
Okay, but your talk was not like a serial, it was like a Bollywood movie. Thank you for the nice talk.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
So, shall we make a move or?
Yeah, we could make out like you have all good experience as a teacher even from starting from Amrita, I think.
So I think.
Thank you, Rajesh, very much. Okay.
So shall we leave?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Dr. Ennis, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Lisha, thanks. Thanks for bringing out this platform, and thanks to CIPLA also.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I think, so if we don't have anything, we can move out. And thank you all for joining us. And we will connect on the coming Tuesday with a new speaker and a new link. Thank you, everyone.